Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the Missouri Ozarks. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the spring of 1892, a soft fog clung to the low ridges of Douglas County, Missouri. Roads were narrow and half swallowed by brush, and what few church steeples there were stood like sentinels over hollows that rarely saw travelers. It was a time when the scars left by the bald knobbers, the vigilante group that had terrorized parts of the Ozarks a few years earlier, still marked the region. Locals would mention them in whispers, as if speaking their name aloud might call something back from the hills. The church at the center of this story stood just outside the village of Coldwater Ford. Officially, it was known as St. Matthew's Chapel of the Hill. Built in 1878 with limestone hauled from a nearby quarry, the church's first minister, Reverend Ezra Hollin, had been a veteran of the war and was known for his strict sermons against mountain sin, his term for the mixture of moonshining, folk charms and unwed births that he believed were corrupting the Ozark valleys. By 1892, Hollin was gone, and his replacement, Reverend Thomas Quill, had arrived from St. Louis. He was a quiet man in his 40s, scholarly in speech but uneasy around locals. His letters, preserved later by his nephew in Illinois, describe an air of superstition and villagers too ready to speak of buried things and punished spirits. Within his first month, several parishioners had already stopped attending service. One of the few remaining was a woman named Martha Greer, a midwife of mixed Irish and Cherokee descent. She lived near the ridgeline and was said to know old remedies involving willow bark and ash water. Quill disapproved of her work and called her a purveyor of old darkness. Then, one humid evening in late May, she vanished. Her small cabin was found open, a kettle still simmering on the stove. Neighbors claimed her chickens hadn't been fed for 3 days. A search party led by Reverend Quill found nothing except strange disturbances in the soil near the back of the chapel. Small, shallow sinkholes as if something beneath had caved in. The constable's report, dated June 2, 1892, lists her as missing, presumed fled. But a marginal note in a different handwriting adds much ground at the north end unsettled. Odor present. The handwriting matches that of Dr. Claymore Baird, a visiting physician from Springfield, who later testified that Reverend Quill forbade any further digging near the site. For weeks after her disappearance, locals spoke of lights moving under the chapel at night. Some believed the earth itself was breathing. Others claimed to hear a faint weeping from beneath the stone floor during Sunday service. The congregation dwindled further. By midsummer, St. Matthew's had become known as the Hollow. Church records suggest the presbytery investigated in August but found no cause for alarm. Yet something in the reports feels incomplete, a gap between what was written and what was deliberately left unsaid. By autumn of 1892, the air in the Ozarks carried a heavy silence. The trees had begun to bronze early, and with them came a sense that something in Coldwater Ford had soured. Reverend Quill's sermons grew shorter, almost mechanical, and he often left the pulpit mid-hymn. Church minutes kept by the remaining deacon, Elias Wren, show repeated absences, and a peculiar entry dated October 9th. Pastor unwell. Reports of voices from beneath the nave. No cause found. Around that same time, a tanner named Jed Murdoch wrote to the local paper in Ava, claiming that his horse had refused to pass the chapel at dusk. The animal went rigid, he wrote, as if scenting something the Lord did not make. The newspaper never printed the letter, but a copy was later found folded inside a county ledger of road repairs, the only surviving trace of his account. Rumors spread that Reverend Quill had begun holding services alone at night. One farmer swore he'd seen candlelight through the stained glass windows long past midnight, accompanied by a rhythmic tapping, like spades against stone. No one dared confront him directly. In a region still haunted by memories of the bald knobber's extrajudicial punishments, silence was often the safer choice. Then came the November thaw. Heavy rain softened the ground around the church, and a portion of the north yard collapsed, revealing what at first looked like a storage pit. Constable Ralph Hinton was called to examine it. His brief statement survives in the Douglas County archives, Found chamber of rough construction, timber supports partially rotted, contained fragments of cloth and 2 small wooden boxes. 1 box empty, 1 sealed. The sealed box was taken to Springfield for examination. No official record describes what was inside, only that it was buried again at the insistence of Reverend Quill. After that, Reverend Quill's health failed rapidly. He stopped eating, stopped writing. In December, he was found collapsed behind the pulpit, his hands blistered and raw. Dr. Baird described it as chemical burns consistent with lye or quicklime exposure. The church bell tolled once that evening and was never rung again. When spring came, St. Matthew's closed its doors entirely. Parishioners drifted to neighboring congregations. Some left the valley altogether. Reverend Quill was sent north for convalescence, but his stagecoach overturned near Lebanon, Missouri. Both driver and passenger were killed instantly. Local folklore insists his coffin arrived at Coldwater Ford sealed with iron nails. Though the undertaker's log merely notes, casket not to be reopened by request of clergy. For a few years, the chapel sat unused, its roof sagging and ivy creeping through broken glass. In 1897, the diocese ordered its records destroyed for preservation of dignity. Yet a handful of surviving pages, a visitor's note, a damaged map, and Dr. Baird's testimony hint that what lay beneath that church was never fully removed. Even decades later, older residents would say that the ground there never settled right again. It shifted, breathed, as if remembering what it once held. In early 1898, a new minister named Reverend Josiah Baird, no relation to Dr. Claymore Baird, was sent to Coldwater Ford to assess whether St. Matthew's could be reclaimed. His arrival was documented in a letter preserved by the Missouri Presbytery office in Springfield. He described a churchyard crusted with lichen and moss so thick it dulled the headstones, and a silence that seemed too deliberate, as though the air itself guarded a secret. Inside, the pews were warped from humidity. Rats had nested in the choir loft, yet it was the odor beneath the floorboards that caught his attention. He wrote that it smelled not of rot, but of lime and damp earth, like something prepared for burial but never finished. He intended to hire workers to repair the foundation. But when he spoke with locals, none would come near the place. Even those who hadn't attended service in years refused to set foot beyond the gate. One old farmer told him plainly, "That ground's already paid for, preacher. Paid in something we ain't got the right to name." Curiously, the county's official land plat of 1899 lists the property as belonging not to the church, but to a private trust under the name of Thomas Quill, who had been dead nearly 7 years. Whether this was clerical error or deliberate avoidance is unclear. The paperwork bears 2 different signatures, one of which matches Quill's handwriting from his 1891 sermon notes. The other appears to be that of a notary from Taney County, a man who disappeared the following year after being implicated in a land fraud investigation related to the remnants of the Bald Knobbers movement. Reverend Baird persisted despite these signs. In his diary, which survives in fragments in a family archive, he recounts that by midsummer he had reopened the chapel for small gatherings. Only 6 people attended. Among them was Hannah Murdoch, daughter of the tanner whose letter had been suppressed years earlier. She kept minutes of these meetings, noting that Baird often prayed beneath his breath between hymns, as though arguing with himself. On the 3rd Sunday after reopening, something occurred that ended those attempts permanently. Hannah's notes stop mid-sentence, but an affidavit filed by a carpenter named Reuben Lowe fills part of the gap. Lowe had been asked to reinforce the pulpit floor, which had begun to sag. When he pried up the rotting planks, he found a hollow cavity, roughly the shape of a small crypt, its interior packed with salt and lime. Inside lay the remains of a wooden lectern and a single brass cross, melted, bent at its base as if exposed to great heat. That discovery sent panic through the tiny congregation. Some claimed that the air turned cold despite the July heat. Others heard a faint scraping sound, like wood dragged slowly across stone. Reverend Baird ordered the floor resealed and locked the doors. Within a month, he too had left the Ozarks, his resignation sent by telegraph from Little Rock. He never returned. By 1900, St. Matthew's had passed again into silence. The county briefly considered demolishing it, but the budget never allowed. So the church stood, empty yet not abandoned, with the forest slowly swallowing it whole. By 1903, travelers passing through the southern Ozarks would still remark on the church's peculiar silhouette. A pointed steeple half collapsed, its bell long missing, ivy crawling up like black veins. The settlement of Coldwater Ford was fading too. The railroad had bypassed it, and what remained were only scattered farms and the echo of old names. Yet the reputation of St. Matthew's Chapel persisted like a warning whispered between generations. That year, Dr. Claymore Baird, the same physician who had once investigated the site in 1892, returned. He was older now, drawn back under the guise of documenting rural health for a state report. His notes, later recovered from a university archive, show that his real purpose was less medical and more personal. "The church," he wrote, "remains a question that the earth has not finished answering." Baird described entering the chapel in daylight, the dust so thick it seemed to hang like smoke. He found old hymnals, water-stained and swollen. Near the altar lay a small iron ring embedded in the floor, the kind used to lift trapdoors in cellars. He recorded that it was immovable to the hand, yet when he returned the next morning the ring was gone. Only the hole where it had been remained, clean and sharp. While in the area, Baird stayed with Elias Wren, the former deacon who had once kept minutes under Reverend Quill. Wren was near blind by then, but still clear of mind. He told Baird that on the night Reverend Quill's coffin had arrived, 3 men from the diocese came secretly and worked until dawn around the churchyard. "They said prayers I never heard before," Wren recalled. "Low ones. Not in Latin, but something older, something the wind carried wrong." Baird's journal hints that he intended to excavate the ground himself, perhaps to verify what the constable's 1892 report had implied. His last dated entry, August 11, 1903, reads simply, "The soil breathes again tonight. Must confirm gas or drainage." 2 days later, his hired assistant found the camp deserted. Baird's tent was intact, his horse still tethered, but there were deep impressions in the mud, as though the ground had briefly caved and then sealed itself again. He was never located. The official conclusion listed him as missing, presumed drowned in nearby creek, though the creek in question was shallow and dry that season. A year later, a wandering journalist from Springfield, Walter Keene, visited the site while writing about Ozark folklore. He mentioned Baird's disappearance in a small column titled "The Hill That Swallowed a Doctor." The article received little attention, except from church officials, who promptly asked the paper to issue a retraction. The editor refused. By winter, however, the issue containing Keene's story had been quietly removed from circulation, and the plates destroyed. Only a single clipping remains, brittle and folded into one of Baird's surviving field envelopes. Locals began calling St. Matthew's the Quiet Hill. They would not point it out directly to travelers, only gesture vaguely northward. Some nights, hunters reported hearing a sound like a distant sermon carried through fog, not words, but the rhythm of one. By 1906, the county had finally decided to list St. Matthew's Chapel as condemned. Officially, the reason was rot and unsafe structure, though anyone living within 10 miles knew that danger wasn't the kind you could fix with nails and timber. The men sent to survey the property refused to stay after sunset. One of them, Albert Krause, later told a Springfield reporter that every echo there came back late, like it had to crawl through something first. His words never made print. The draft article was found years later, among unsent correspondence in the paper's basement. Around that same time, a group of local children playing near the overgrown churchyard found fragments of what looked like a communion plate and several scraps of paper wrapped in oilcloth. When delivered to the constable, the papers turned out to be sermon notes written by Reverend Quill. The ink was blurred by moisture, but 2 lines remained legible. "Salt for the mouth, lime for the tongue. If the soul won't sleep, the stone must remember for it." Those notes reignited the old rumors that Quill's final services were not prayers, but rituals meant to contain something beneath the floor. Elders in nearby Ava and Norwood began warning their children not to wander near the chapel after dusk. One farmer claimed his lantern dimmed whenever he faced the hill. Another said his well water tasted of copper whenever rain pooled near the chapel ruins. In 1908, a traveling photographer named Samuel Raikes passed through Coldwater Ford and took one of the last known images of St. Matthew's. The glass plate negative still exists in a private collection, showing the skeletal frame of the church with sunlight piercing through the collapsed roof. Yet closer inspection reveals a faint blur near the entrance. Not quite human. Not quite shadow, standing as if halfway through the doorway. Raikes made no mention of it in his field log, but in a letter to his sister he wrote, "The camera caught what I did not see, a posture of watching, perhaps of waiting." By the turn of the decade, the county courthouse fire of 1910 destroyed most records relating to the property. Some said the blaze began after officials attempted to recatalogue the church deeds under a new diocese name. The fire spread unnaturally fast for damp paper, consuming an entire wing of the building in less than an hour. Witnesses swore they heard a crackling sound, like singing. Again, no formal inquiry followed. The name St. Matthew's faded from official maps, replaced simply with old foundation. Travelers stopped asking and locals stopped explaining. Yet every few years, someone would wander through the hills and describe finding carved stones deep in the brush, each marked with an unfamiliar sigil, a shape like a cross turned sideways and split down the middle. Even decades later, when the Ozarks began attracting folklorists and rural historians, they avoided that site. One scholar at Drury College noted that even birds avoided perching on the trees that grew from its soil. Whether this was superstition or something deeper, no one could say. By 1912, the Ozarks had entered a quieter age. The railroads had thinned the forests, towns grew around new mills, and the name Coldwater Ford barely appeared on regional maps. Yet even as the modern world crept closer, the hill where St. Matthew's once stood remained curiously untouched. Locals said every attempt to cut timber there ended the same way. Saw teeth snapping, oxen refusing to move, tools lost overnight. The county began calling it Parcel 9C, unsuitable for agriculture. That summer, a surveyor named Henry Dalrymple was sent to remeasure the area for a new road plan. In his logbook, now kept at the Douglas County Historical Society, he noted the remains of a foundation, limestone, appearing to have been heated from below. Beneath one of the flagstones, he found a cavity filled with white dust and fragments of metal fixtures, perhaps from an altar lamp. He kept a sample of the dust, assuming it was ash, and mailed it to a laboratory in St. Louis. The reply, dated September 3, 1912, reads simply, "Composition undetermined, shows no organic residue, yet resists moisture like bone." Dalrymple stayed one night in a tent near the hill to finish his mapping. His last entry reads, "Wind strong after midnight, sounds below soil, not wind." When the road crew arrived 2 days later, they found the surveyor gone. His tripod and measuring chain were laid neatly by the tent flap. The ground beneath was disturbed, not dug but sagged inward like breath drawn in reverse. His compass was later found half a mile downslope, its needle spinning without rest. Around this time, the Springfield Herald published a small feature about vanishing places of the Ozarks, where they mentioned the earlier history of the Bald Knobbers and their hidden trials in remote church basements. In a brief paragraph, they referenced a buried meeting hall once sealed by lime and scripture, possibly alluding to St. Matthew's. Church officials in Springfield quickly wrote to the editor, denying the claim and reminding the paper of its duty to the public peace. The article was quietly removed from later reprints. Still, the whispers grew. An aging midwife named Ellen Greer, who claimed to be a niece of the vanished Martha Greer, told a traveling ethnographer that her aunt's name had once been painted on a small board hung behind the pulpit, as a promise, she said, to keep her from coming back. The ethnographer recorded her story in a 1913 field notebook, later published decades afterward under the title Ozark Superstitions and Burial Customs. He described Ellen's eyes as afraid of remembering. It was around this same period that a group of schoolboys exploring the woods near Parcel 9C reported hearing a church bell ringing under the ground. Their parents scolded them for lying, yet 3 separate households recalled their children waking that same night, weeping and covering their ears. One boy, the youngest, was said to murmur in his sleep, "It's still preaching." The teen. Following spring, a flash flood washed away part of the hillside, exposing the foundation again. For a few brief days, travelers on the dirt road could see the outline of a stone arch, half buried like a mouth trying to reopen. When the 1913 floodwaters finally receded, the exposed arch drew a handful of curious onlookers. Among them was Professor Louis Redfield, a lecturer from the newly established Southwest Missouri State Normal School, who had an amateur interest in local folklore and geology. Redfield described the site in a letter to a colleague. "The stones form a near-perfect half-circle, set too deliberately to be natural. Mortar appears burned, not crumbled. The interior seems to breathe cold air, though no draft is felt from without." Redfield hired 2 local laborers to help him dig a few feet into the exposed section. They lasted less than an hour. One complained of nausea and headaches, the other of a taste of pennies in his mouth. When they withdrew, both said the earth under their spades had felt soft like dough, then suddenly hard, as though resisting. Redfield noted that neither man would accept payment. They simply left their tools behind and refused to return. Still intrigued, Redfield measured the slope and concluded that what they'd uncovered might be the upper edge of a vault, likely built beneath the old church. He theorized that the use of lime and salt, both mentioned in Quill's surviving notes, was part of a preservation attempt. Yet he admitted in the same letter, "Preserved what, I cannot say." That summer, Redfield submitted a brief to the Missouri Archaeological Society, but it was quietly dismissed. The society chair, in his polite rejection, remarked that folkloric contamination of data renders the site unfit for academic record. Disappointed, Redfield stored his sketches in a university drawer and moved on to other studies. It wasn't until 20 years later that the folder was rediscovered, its paper edges darkened by what archivists described as chemical bloom. Back in Coldwater Ford, however, the land did not forget him. Locals began claiming that strange lights flickered over the hill again, not constant, but rhythmic. Flashes of pale green, like lanterns seen through water. Hunters reported finding their dogs trembling, refusing to go near the slope. An old farmer, Lemuel Wren, grandson of the former Deacon Elias, swore he once saw a figure kneeling where the arch had been unearthed. He described it as wearing a black vestment, though no head was visible, just emptiness where a face should be. County officials ordered the area fenced for safety, citing erosion concerns. In reality, a quiet directive from the local diocese had already circulated, urging nearby congregations to avoid conducting burials or ceremonies within 1 mile of the old foundation. The instruction was never written publicly, only passed by word among priests. Even decades later, retired clergy would recall it uneasily, referring to the Quill Clause. By the winter of 1914, grass and frost had covered the exposed stones again. The arch vanished beneath the earth, and Coldwater Ford went silent once more. But the diaries and letters that survived from that brief excavation suggest something more permanent had shifted. The soil had been disturbed, not just physically, but in memory. Those who lived near it began to dream of sermons they had never heard, spoken in voices they couldn't identify. Many recorded waking to the faint smell of lime. The winter of 1915 was unusually hard in the Ozarks. Deep snow muffled the valleys, and the few remaining families near Coldwater Ford stayed indoors for months. It was during that isolation that talk of the voices returned. Several diaries from the period mention hearing muffled sounds carried through the frozen ground, not the shifting of frost, but syllables distinct and paced like speech. One entry, belonging to Margaret Wren, wife of Lemuel, reads sounded as though beneath the stove amid low pleading. Said something about keeping the mouth shut. Lemuel wouldn't hear it, though the dog howled till dawn. That same week, a neighboring homestead caught fire after the family reportedly tried to burn an old chest found while digging a new root cellar. The ashes, examined later by the sheriff, contained fragments of brass and something like melted glass. The report was filed, but later struck through with the words, "superstitious matter." In February, a traveling merchant from Ava named Ephraim Cole took refuge for the night in one of the abandoned cabins near Parcel 9C. His journal, found decades later among his effects, tells of being awakened by a steady ringing, faint, metallic and hollow, as if struck from underground. He wrote, "I counted 12 tolls, then silence. When I looked outside, the snow around the door was disturbed, but no tracks led to it. Cole left before dawn and refused to travel that route again." The following spring brought the return of Professor Redfield. Despite the warnings from his peers, he could not let the matter rest. He came with new equipment, a barometer, a hand auger, and a field assistant named Mr. Lionel Krantz, a German-born student studying soil composition. Their plan was simple: bore a small core through the hill and test for subsurface gases. According to Krantz's surviving notes, they drilled for less than 2 feet before striking a hollow void with measurable suction. The barometer needle quivered wildly, then froze. Redfield ordered the hole sealed at once, muttering, "It exhales, not air." That night, Redfield and Krantz camped nearby. In the morning, Krantz awoke alone. Redfield's tent stood open, his boots neatly placed by the flap. His field journal was found half-filled with incoherent scrawls, ending in a line written 3 times. Salt and lime hold, but not forever. Krantz fled the site and reported the disappearance in Ava 2 days later. No search was organized. The sheriff merely noted, "Likely lost to the elements." Later that summer, the hill was hit by lightning. The ensuing fire burned for 3 days without spreading beyond its perimeter. Witnesses claimed the flames burned white, almost colorless, leaving behind a perfect ring of blackened grass. Within that ring, nothing grew again for decades. Old-timers said that's where Redfield's tent had stood. From then on, the towns around the Ozarks began calling the area the Preacher's Pit. No one agreed on why. Some thought it referred to Quill, others to the idea of an unfinished sermon buried alive beneath the earth. But the name endured, long after the story faded. By 1917, the United States had entered the Great War, and even the remote corners of Missouri were touched by it. Men from the Ozarks went overseas and the hills emptied. The Preacher's Pit, as it was now called, stood untouched, a scar of blackened soil that resisted both snow and seed. Yet the silence around it didn't last. That year, a letter surfaced at the Springfield Presbytery office, written by a missionary named Reverend Paul Henson, who claimed to have found an unregistered property of ecclesiastical nature near Coldwater Ford. His tone was cautious, but one line stood out. It appears to be the remains of a chapel or vault. Symbols not of any modern order are carved into its stones. I request guidance on whether to sanctify or seal it. The response, dated July 14, 1917, came from a senior cleric in St. Louis: "Seal and make no record." That phrase was underlined twice. There is no indication Henson ever did. Later correspondence shows he returned home that autumn, ill and delirious. Speaking of songs without mouths, he died within weeks, and his effects, a small bag of soil and a cracked wooden rosary, were never catalogued. Meanwhile, returning soldiers began reporting strange lights over the hill again, visible from the old wagon road at dusk. They described it as a faint blue shimmer rising from the ground and dispersing into the trees. One veteran, Corporal Raymond Polk, wrote to his sister, "It looked like smoke at first, but it glowed, as if the earth was giving off the light itself. When he came closer, the light vanished, but he noticed the ground felt warm even in the cool autumn air. Around that same time, local children began daring each other to approach the site." A newspaper clipping from the Douglas County Courier, October 1917, recounts the story of a boy named Caleb Finch, who disappeared for 2 days while playing near the hill. When found, he was unhurt but mute. According to his parents, he never spoke again, though he would hum a single low tone every Sunday morning, always at the same hour, 11. These incidents, though small and scattered, revived older fears. A few of the valley's elders began pressing for the land to be blessed again, but the church's regional leadership, still sensitive about the Quill case, refused involvement. One bishop reportedly said, "Some ground is best left unspoken, lest the prayer wake what silence keeps." That winter, a heavy frost split several stones around the site, revealing what appeared to be charred wood beneath, possibly remnants of the old pulpit or floorboards. The constable noted the find, but, recalling past trouble, ordered it reburied. He later told a neighbor, "The soil didn't want to stay put. Every shovelful felt like it was breathing back at you." By the war's end, the hill was considered cursed ground. The new road map rerouted a full mile east to avoid it. Locals crossed themselves when passing the turnoff, even those who hadn't been to church in years. And though no one could prove anything, the story of the preacher, the vault, and the buried congregation began merging into one, a tale told by firelight, each version darker than the last. By 1920, a schoolteacher named Martha Glenn from Ava, Missouri, took an interest in the legends surrounding Coldwater Ford. She had heard the stories from her pupils, whispered warnings about the buried church and the preacher who preached to bones. Martha was a rational woman, educated in Springfield and known for her skepticism of superstition. She began collecting testimonies from the oldest residents she could find, her handwritten notes, preserved in fragments at the Wright County Historical Society, are our most detailed civilian record of the case after the turn of the century. She wrote, "Every tale, no matter how fantastical, points back to one hill. The dates differ, but the pattern remains. A structure once consecrated, later erased, its name forbidden. Locals avoid it not out of fear of ghosts, but out of respect, as though the soil keeps a promise they dare not break." Glenn visited the site in late September of that year. Her diary mentions the remnants of stacked limestone, barely visible under vine and earth, and the faint odor of damp ashes. She also described something she called the hum, a low vibration she felt through the soles of her boots that stopped the moment she spoke aloud. She chalked it up to perhaps underground springs, though her tone betrayed unease. What happened next became the center of a minor newspaper stir. The following morning, a farmhand found Glenn's buggy abandoned at the crossroads, horse still tied but reins hanging loose. She returned 3 days later, disoriented and covered in fine dust. She told the sheriff she had lost the daylight. When pressed, she said she had gone underground, into a place of stone. No doors, no echo. The sheriff's report, dated October 3, 1920, notes, subject coherent but withdrawn. Claims entry through ground opening that was not visible upon return. Advises against further exploration. Glenn left the county within the month and never resumed teaching. Her brother, who collected her belongings years later, said she refused to enter churches or even walk past them. Among her papers, one folded map stood out, a rough sketch of the Ozarks ridgeline with a faint X marked north of Bryant Creek. Along the bottom edge she had written, "The ground listens." Not long after her disappearance, Reverend Fletcher, now in his 80s, was interviewed one final time by a county historian. When asked about the burned chapel and its missing records, he grew quiet. Then, almost in a whisper, he said, "The mistake was thinking the sin ended with the fire. We only burned the walls, not what was underneath." The historian dismissed it as the ramblings of an old man. Yet his words matched a line found in an unsigned church memorandum from 1894. The foundation remains. Do not dig. Let the ground stand. By 1922, Martha Glenn's story had faded into rumor, but a few locals still claimed that on windless nights, her voice could be heard near the old ridge, softly reciting names as if taking attendance. In the years that followed, the region around Coldwater Ford saw the slow creep of modernity. Telegraph lines, paved roads, and even a short-lived rail spur that cut through the eastern hills. But no one ever laid track near the burned church site. The surveyors reportedly marked the soil there as unstable, though no geological reason was ever confirmed. One company foreman later admitted, "The men refused to dig, said the earth moaned when they struck it." By 1925, only a handful of locals still spoke of the case openly. Among them was Dr. E.C. Lemons, a retired physician from Douglas County, who had once treated Reverend Quill's surviving congregants. In an article for the Ozark Medical Review, he described their condition as a collective disturbance of faith manifesting through waking hallucination and syncope. But privately, in a letter to a colleague, he confessed doubt. Their pulse was normal, their eyes alert. Yet every one of them reported the same sensation of something standing just behind them, unseen, waiting for the hymn to end. That same year, a small fire broke out in the courthouse archives at Hartville. It was contained within minutes, but among the damaged files were several boxes labeled Ecclesiastical Complaints, 1890-1895. One surviving folder bore only a partial title, Quill, et unauthorized burial conduct. The rest was burned beyond recognition. No one ever found the burial ledger that Fletcher had mentioned decades before. Meanwhile, the site itself grew wilder. Vines covered the old markers, and the forest reclaimed the narrow path that once led to the ridge. Travelers described the area as strangely still. No birdsong, no insects. A hunter named Silas Griggs wrote in his 1927 field journal, "The woods there are quiet as a room after prayer. You walk 20 paces and feel like someone has just stopped talking." It was around this time that the name Bald Knobbers surfaced again, not as vigilantes now, but as a historical society trying to trace their legacy. One of their surviving members, an elderly man named Ira Cantrell, claimed that a few of the early Knobbers had met at the old chapel grounds in 1888. They used it, he said, for private penance and rebaptisms, acts the formal church would never sanction. This admission, printed briefly in a Springfield pamphlet, drew sharp criticism and was quickly retracted. Yet it linked the Quill affair to a much older network of secret religious gatherings in the Ozarks, groups that blurred the line between justice, worship and fear. Cantrell's last note, before his death in 1928, contained a single unfinished sentence. "We thought we were saving them, but something else was already waiting." That same year, lightning struck the ridge. Locals reported the ground burning for nearly an hour, even under pouring rain. When it finally cooled, the outline of a crude cross, scorched deep into the soil, could be seen from the road. A traveling photographer tried to capture it days later, but every plate came out black, as though overexposed by something unseen, and once again, the county officials said nothing. The entry in the 1928 records reads simply, "Brush fire contained." By the early 1930s, the legend of the erased church had become a kind of whispered folklore among the older families of the Ozarks. Children were told not to wander past the ridge after sunset. Hunters left a small cross of twigs on the trail as they passed, a silent token of respect. Even the new preachers avoided mentioning Reverend Quill's name from the pulpit, calling him instead the Lost Shepherd. But not everyone was content to leave it buried. In 1931, Professor Alton Reeve from the University of Missouri began a private ethnographic study of Ozark superstitions. His interest was purely academic. He sought to prove that every ghost story in the region stemmed from explainable causes, isolation, poverty, or religious extremism. Reeve traveled to Wright County that summer, interviewing residents about the Quill case. One of his notebooks, now archived at Columbia, includes the statement of an elderly woman identified only as Mrs. A.G., likely Agnes Greer, granddaughter of one of the original parishioners. She said, "My father told me the church was never right from the day it was raised. The foundation was laid on hollow ground, and the pastor said the earth sang when they struck it with the first spade. They thought it was blessed, but later they said it was calling something up." Reeve dismissed it as rural exaggeration, but when he visited the hill himself, his tone shifted. In a letter to his department chair, he described finding limestone fragments consistent with ecclesiastical construction and what appeared to be a subterranean cavity beneath the western edge. He theorized it might have been a storm cellar or crypt. But his excavation request was denied after the local presbytery filed an objection, stating that the property was sanctified ground, not to be disturbed. Still, Reeve was persistent. On the night of August 12, 1931, he returned alone with 2 laborers from Ava. What happened next is pieced together only from an unsigned field report and fragments of his journal. The workers later claimed they opened a narrow fissure large enough for a man to crawl through, leading into a stone chamber with a curved ceiling. The air was dry and strangely warm. They found no coffins, only fragments of wood and a rusted iron stand resembling a lectern. Then, according to their testimony, Reeve began reciting something under his breath, words from a prayer neither man recognized. Moments later, one of them claimed the lantern flickered out, though no wind touched it. When they lit it again, Reeve was gone. His notebook lay on the ground, open to a single line written shakily across the page. It was never a church. A search party combed the area for 3 days. They found no trace of him, except a torn coat sleeve near the fissure and the smell of sulfur in the soil. The presbytery quickly ordered the hole sealed with limestone and mortar. The two laborers left town within a week and refused to discuss the matter again. Professor Reeves' disappearance was never officially explained. The university listed it as presumed accident during fieldwork, yet his missing person report remained open for nearly 20 years. The final note, written in 1950 by a deputy archivist, reads simply, "Site still avoided by locals. No vegetation. The Depression years passed quietly in the Ozarks, but the old story still circulated, thinner now, almost like an echo. In the cold winters of the late 1930s, families would gather near their hearths and retell it to the children, always ending with the same warning: don't follow singing after dark." Then in 1938, the Works Progress Administration began documenting Missouri's rural folklore. A young field interviewer named Eleanor Witt was assigned to Wright County. She was bright, methodical, and unshaken by the eerie tone of the local tales, until she heard about the erased church. The name intrigued her. She wrote in her field diary, "The townsfolk do not speak it aloud. They say the church was burned, the preacher vanished, and the ground itself remembers." Witt conducted 9 interviews over 2 weeks, each more reluctant than the last. One old farmer, Leland Coates, gave the most coherent account. His father had worked on the church's foundation as a young man. Coates recalled hearing that a tunnel ran under the nave, too narrow for a man, but it carried sound. His exact words were chilling. They said when the choir sang, you could hear the earth hum back, and not loud but steady, like something joining in from below. Eleanor typed her notes and sent them to the WPA regional office in Jefferson City. The submission was acknowledged, but never published. Her supervisor later claimed the materials were too ecclesiastically sensitive. Yet, a carbon copy of her transcript surfaced decades later, showing she had appended a personal note: visited site on Sunday late afternoon, ground warmer than surrounding area, heard what might have been wind through stone, but no trees were moving. She did not return the next day. Her final letter to her sister, mailed that same evening from Ava, contained only one line of significance: the place doesn't want to be remembered. The following spring, heavy rains caused a landslide near the ridge. Locals reported that a section of earth gave way, revealing part of a buried wall. Pale limestone blocks blackened by fire. No human remains were found, but there was a single brass crucifix fused to the stone as if melted in place. The constable ordered the slide area filled, fearing further collapse. By the time the ground was stable again, the cross was gone. In the 1940s, when county lines were redrawn and new survey maps printed, the hill was omitted entirely. The cartographers said the elevation data was incomplete, though privately one of them admitted, "We were told not to mark it." Said it wasn't land the state claimed anymore. Old residents noticed that even the birds avoided flying over it. The air there stayed warmer year-round, and snow would melt faster on its slope, a patch of bare earth that never seemed to cool. A hunter in 1943 remarked that when he aimed his rifle toward the ridge, his dog began to whine, tail between its legs, and refused to move forward. By the end of the decade, few who knew the original story were still alive. The younger generation dismissed it as rural superstition, a ghost tale to frighten children. Yet when the evening bells rang across the valley, many still paused for a moment, listening to see if another sound answered back from the woods. By 1949, the world had moved on, war abroad, cities growing, radios filling homes with modern noise. But the hill near Coldwater Ford remained strangely untouched by all that. A single gravel road curved around it now, a forgotten loop that ended nowhere. The few travelers who passed through rarely stopped. Those who did often remarked on the silence, not emptiness but silence with presence. That winter, a regional survey team from the Missouri Geological Bureau came to the area to chart subterranean springs and mineral deposits. One of their notes, later misfiled under anomalous thermal readings, referred to a localized zone of residual heat inconsistent with surrounding terrain. The coordinates matched the site of the old church. They found no evidence of volcanic activity or methane release. Just warm earth, the report concluded, as if the ground itself retained some memory of fire. Among the team was a young assistant named Thomas Bell, fresh from the University of Arkansas. Bell kept a meticulous field log, which survived among his personal effects decades later. His entry for February 3rd reads, "Excavated shallow trench near ridge. Soil distinctly layered with char. Lower strata gives faint metallic odor. Unidentified residue glows briefly under lamplight, though not phosphorescent. No logical explanation. The official report omitted those findings." Bell later told a colleague that when he touched one of the buried stones, he felt a low vibration, like machinery far underground. The others felt nothing. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning he packed his gear and left before dawn, claiming an urgent telegram from home. He never returned to state service. Later that year, the Bureau's Central Archive suffered an electrical fire. A coincidence, perhaps destroying a portion of the Geological Survey files from 1948-1950. Only a single summary remained, typed by Bell before he resigned. The last line was underlined. "Recommend no further excavation." Ground exhibits persistent resonance. Local legend grew quiet after that. The community shrank, old roads turned to weeds, and maps stopped showing the name Coldwater Ford. The only remaining reference was in a 1951 church ledger, listing discontinued parish holdings, Wright County, rural. The line beneath read, "Burn site 1892, land unfit for consecration." Yet some fragments of memory refused to die. A farmer named Willard Dake claimed he still heard the hum every Easter morning, faint but steady, carrying through the fog like the echo of an organ beneath the ground. His son dismissed it, until one dawn in 1954 when he heard it too. Both men described the same sound, a single sustained note, neither wind nor machine rising and fading in even rhythm, as if marking a service no one had called, and there, in that quiet valley, nothing grew for miles around the ridge. Even cattle refused to graze near it. The soil remained warm. The county stopped taxing the land altogether. On the deed, still stored in a courthouse drawer in Ava, 3 faint words are written in pencil beside the property number: "Let it rest." By 1956, few alive even remembered that a church had once stood there. The ridge had no name on maps, only a set of coordinates known to county clerks and surveyors who never spoke of it. Yet that spring, when Missouri's drought cracked open the fields, a traveling photographer named Harlan Voss stumbled upon it while documenting rural hardship for a St. Louis newspaper. Voss was no stranger to desolation. He'd photographed flood ruins, abandoned mines, dust storms. But what he saw near the old Coldwater Ford unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite explain. His journal entry from April 14, 1956 reads, "The hill stands wrong. No birds, no wind. Just a still heat. My light meter went wild at readings spiking, then flat. I took 3 shots. Each one turned black. When he returned to his darkroom in Springfield, the negatives appeared scorched, not from exposure or chemical error, but as though the image itself had burned from within. Only the edges remained clear, the outline of a slope, and what might have been a standing structure of stone, faint and blurred, where none was visible when he took the photo." Voss sent one of the prints to the Missouri Historical Review, noting its oddity. The editor filed it away without comment. Months later, that office too suffered a fire, small but precise, consuming only the drawer that held the print. The incident never made the papers. Around the same time, a new pastor named Reverend Douglas Shaw arrived in Ava. He'd been warned about the old legends, but dismissed them as rural folklore. Still, he was curious about the parcel of untended land no congregation claimed. He asked the presbytery if he might bless it, to which an elderly clerk reportedly replied, "We tried that once." It blessed us back. Shaw ignored the warning. On May 5, 1957, accompanied by 2 parishioners, he hiked to the ridge with a small wooden cross and a flask of holy water. According to his own later account, the ground beneath his feet trembled faintly when he began to pray. His voice faltered as the wind died mid-sentence, and for a moment, the air felt heavy, not cold but close, as though the world were holding its breath. He finished the prayer quickly and left the cross planted in the soil. When he returned a week later, it was gone. Only a small indentation remained, shaped like a footprint pressed deep into ash. Shaw never spoke of it publicly again, though in his private journal, recovered years later by his son, he wrote, "The hill is not haunted. It is listening. It waits for names it once knew, After that, even the church stopped mentioning the site. The presbytery's correspondence from the late 1950s contains one last entry, stamped confidential. Property remains under seal per directive of 1894. No further inquiry. By the time the 1960 census arrived, Coldwater Ford no longer existed on paper. Its remaining families had moved closer to Mansfield and Seymour. The ridge stood alone, surrounded by wild grass and the unbroken murmur of insects, except there, in that circle of barren earth, where silence still ruled. By 1962, Missouri's landscape was changing, power lines stretching through valleys, new highways cutting through forgotten farmland. Yet that single rise above Coldwater Ford remained untouched, as if progress itself avoided it. Aerial surveyors flying overhead noticed the anomaly, a circular patch of earth that stayed bare through every season, perfectly centered, always the same diameter. The report from Midwestern Aerial Imaging Casa, dated June 14, 1962, described it clinically. 1 acre section displaying persistent non-growth pattern. Soil tone indicates thermal variance or subsurface obstruction. Surrounding vegetation normal. It was marked for geological follow-up, but none was conducted. The agency's director later admitted quietly, "The county advised us not to pursue it," said the land was under ecclesiastical stewardship. That same summer, an anthropology graduate named Janet Holbrook came to Wright County chasing ghost stories for her thesis on rural memory and religious myth. When she asked about the erased church, most residents turned away. An elderly shopkeeper finally told her, "You'll find the place easy enough. Just drive until the crickets stop." She did. Her field notes record the precise moment. 2:47 p.m. Sound ceased. No insects, no birds. Air heavier. Temperature noticeably warmer. Wind shifts upward instead of across. She wrote that she found the faint outline of limestone underfoot and the scent of something metallic, like iron or blood, faintly on the air. Holbrook took soil samples, which she mailed back to Columbia for testing. The results, recorded by her advisor Dr. Samuel Pruitt, showed no unusual composition, only a slightly elevated sulfur content. But the test jars, kept in the lab overnight, reportedly cracked their glass lids by morning. Pruitt dismissed it as a pressure error, though he noted that the liquid inside had turned cloudy grey. When Holbrook returned to the ridge 2 weeks later, she found her earlier footprints gone and the ground oddly smooth, as if it had been sifted. In her final entry, she wrote, "Standing here feels like standing inside a heartbeat. There is no sound, but something steady, deep below like waiting breath." She left the Ozarks soon after and never completed her thesis. Her notes were discovered years later in a sealed envelope marked, "Do Not Archive." Inside, along with her field sketches, was a single scrap of paper that read, "Names buried. Voices listening. Fire remembers." During that decade, local authorities fenced off the ridge under the guise of soil preservation. They cited risk of collapse, though no visible sinkhole existed. The fence, however, soon fell, overtaken by creeping vines, everywhere except over the center, where the earth stayed bare. By 1968, construction crews planning a small highway extension approached the area. The foreman, a veteran from Springfield, refused the contract after visiting the site. In his own words, "It isn't cursed. It's awake." After that, the hill was left off all public planning maps. No deeds, no property markers, no references except a single hand-drawn cross in the county archives with one word beside it, scrawled in fading ink. Still, by the early 1970s, the ridge at Coldwater Ford had taken on an almost mythic silence. Locals simply called it the still place. Hunters skirted its edges, hikers marked detours, and the few who dared camp nearby often left before dawn, complaining of pressure in the chest or of waking to hear a faint hymn drifting through the mist, sung by no one. In 1972, a documentary team from St. Louis Public Television, led by producer Evan Mercer, visited Wright County for a series called Forgotten Corners of America. They'd heard rumors of a church the map forgot and thought it might make a curious segment about folklore's persistence. The footage they shot, though mostly lost, exists in fragments. Reels discovered decades later in an abandoned storage unit near Jefferson City. In the surviving minutes, the team walks through tall grass toward the ridge. Mercer's voice narrates, "Locals claim the ground here refuses seed. They say a church once stood on this hill in 1892, burned, buried, and erased." Behind him, the cameraman pans over the barren circle. The sound suddenly warps, a faint oscillation under the audio track, not static, more like a sustained tone. Mercer turns as if hearing something off camera. The film cuts abruptly to black crew logs recovered, later indicate the camera jammed at that precise moment. The operator, Henry Lang, reported that the air vibrated like wire, and the mic cable grew warm in his hand. They packed up early. The footage was sent for development, but the first reel, the one showing the approach to the ridge, arrived completely transparent, as though never exposed at all. Weeks later, Mercer's assistant received an unsigned letter postmarked from Ava. It read, "You filmed where you shouldn't. That hill was spoken for. Leave it under silence." The team abandoned the segment. The network replaced it with a light-hearted piece about antique fairs in Kansas City. But within a year, 2 members of the crew, Mercer and Lang, died in unrelated accidents. Their families both reported receiving the same envelope in the mail afterward, containing a single photograph, the ridge, seen from afar, blank and colorless. On the back of each print was written in cramped handwriting, "We told you not to look." The local church in Ava finally addressed the matter privately that winter. The minutes of a 1973 meeting, still preserved in faded type, contain this brief note. Concerning the property north of Bryant Creek, the standing directive remains in effect. No further inquiry, no restoration, no record. By then, the last witnesses to the original fire of 1892 were long gone. Yet on certain autumn nights, motorists passing along the distant highway swore they could see a pale shimmer rising over the trees, not flame, not light, but something slower, rhythmic, as though the ground itself was breathing. And in old letters still stored in dusty church boxes, one phrase appears again and again. From 1894 to 1973, a quiet reminder of what everyone in the Ozarks seemed to know, but never said aloud. Some fires don't die. They wait. In 1987, the ridge was purchased quietly by a private buyer, a shell company registered in Illinois under the name Coldwater Holdings. The deed listed no human representatives, only a post office box in St. Louis. A few weeks later, fencing crews returned to the hill and erected a tall barrier of corrugated steel. No one was allowed near. Locals said the trucks came at night. A low hum filled the valley for hours, followed by what witnesses described as a flash with no thunder. When morning came, the air smelled faintly of ozone, and every radio in town hissed with static for 3 days straight. The Wright County Register, in a short column dated August 23, 1987, wrote only, "Soil stabilization work ongoing north of Bryant Creek. No comment from county officials." That was the last time the ridge appeared in print. In the decades since, time has folded neatly over that wound of land. Aerial maps now show the area as an unbroken swath of forest, but if you drive down the back road off Highway 95, there's a point where the trees suddenly thin and the air grows stiller. The birds stop. You'll see nothing unusual, just a long rise covered in pale grass. But if you roll down your window and listen closely, you might hear a low note beneath the wind, the kind of tone that sits right between sound and memory. Old-timers say that's the church still breathing. They claim that on certain Halloweens, if the fog rolls heavy enough through the valley, you can see faint lanterns moving up the hill, not torches, but dim orange orbs swaying in the mist, rising one by one like parishioners taking their seats. And if you stay long enough, you might hear the start of a hymn, slow, off-key, but unmistakably human. The melody matches no known tune, yet something about it feels familiar, ancient, like the heartbeat of a place that refused to die. Some say the bald knobbers never truly left. Others believe it's the land itself remembering every name, every oath, every betrayal whispered in the dark. In 2019, a new developer tried to purchase the ridge for a communications tower. The sale fell through when surveyors' instruments failed repeatedly, GPS readings spinning in circles, compasses refusing to settle. The project was abandoned. The paperwork listed the reason as magnetic interference undefined. Today, the hill has no road sign, no marker, no map entry. Just a patch of silence in the heart of Missouri. a place that looks ordinary until you stand upon it and realize the earth beneath you feels warm, as though something far below is still burning. Locals still have a phrase for it, passed quietly from one generation to the next. Don't speak the name of the fire that remembers, and when the October winds come, the same chill that once swept through Ozark Hollows more than a century ago. The people of Wright County still close their shutters early and leave a single candle burning in the window. Not for prayer, not for comfort, but for remembrance, because in Clay Hollow and all the valleys beyond, one truth remains: some churches fall. Some are buried and some never stop preaching.